I have the honor to moderate the opening of the conference. So, let me welcome you on behalf of the organizing committee. You can see the names of the organizing committee on your agenda. The Elder Metropolitan Emmanuel of Chalcedon, the Metropolitan Maximus of Selivria, My Holiness Mr. Papanikolaou and Mr. Kalaitzidis. Thank you all. And of course, I would like to thank the two members of the Secretariat, Father Ecumenius, the Deacon of the Secretariat, and Dr. Nikolaos Asproulis. I would like to thank Father Ecumenius because he had the huge responsibility to coordinate all the necessary actions for the organization of this conference. The organizing committee and everybody present here would like to thank the sponsors of this conference. Father Dimitrios Linos, the Academy of Theological Studies of Volos, and the Center of Orthodox and Christian Studies of the Fordham University. And of course, everybody else who contributed to this conference. I would also like to thank the speakers, those that came from far away to attend this conference, then those who came from Greece and those who live here. We are going to begin with some opening remarks by the Bishop of Branisovo, Ignatius, on behalf of the Church of Serbia. Please, the floor to you. Your All Holiness, Your Eminences, Your Grace, Fathers, Professors, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and I feel really emotional about it to attend this conference, to be amongst you and convey the blessings of the Patriarch of Serbia, Porphyrios. To His All Holiness and to all of you, the participants. And also the wish to hold a constructive and fruitful conference. So that the words and the thinking of the late Metropolitan of Pergamon, Zizioulas, be heard loud and clear. As you all know better than me, the theological thinking, his theological thinking and words goes beyond the Church of Constantinople and, might I say, the entire Orthodoxy. And of course, hopefully us that are still alive will convey to the current and next generations the importance and significance of his words and thinking. The Metropolitan of Pergamon talked about the eternal life, which is, according to his own words, is offered only through the Orthodox Church. He had repeatedly said, "Ex ecclesiam, there is no salvation." I don't want to bore you with too many words, so I would like to wish you once again to all participants in this conference to spend the next 3 days exchanging thoughts, ideas on the theology of the late Metropolitan of Pergamon.
πολλά έτη και
May you live
Παναγιώτατε
long,
ευλόγησον
and
την ευχή σας.
your all holiness please bless us. In Geneva, when I used to talk there, Serbian students used to say that they are proud because they read all the works of the Metropolitan because he's always translated in Serbian. This is thanks to you. The representative of the Theological Academy of Volos would like to share a few words. Mr. Pandalis Kalaididis. Your All Holiness, Your Eminences, Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't know that I was supposed to give an opening speech, so I'm completely unprepared. I will speak from the heart. It is a great honor and a pleasure to open this international conference on the theological legacy and ecumenical vision in memory of the Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon, a conference that is organized here in Constantinople, where in 1986 Ioannis Zizioulas was enthroned as the Metropolitan of Pergamon. And there is a symbolism there. I would like to remind you that the Academy of Theological Studies of Volos honored the Metropolitan while alive. In October 2011, we welcomed him as an honorary member and partner of our Academy. We held a conference on his theological work, and we published a volume with a text from this conference. The late Metropolitan of Pergamon paid us great honor with his trust, with his presence in many conferences. He delivered speeches. And I would like to stress, I would like to highlight the affinity of spirit that we felt with him, with his work that has truly inspired us and guides us and has guided our steps. For example, in 2000-2001, in our first year, we held a series of lectures called Theology and Eschatology, inspired by him. Your All Holiness, please bless this conference and our efforts. We are particularly happy and proud for this cooperation with the Ecumenical Patriarchate and with the Center of Orthodox Studies of the University of Fordham. Thank you for the warm welcome and your trust. I do hope that we will hold a fruitful and constructive dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Kalaididis. Both me and His Eminence were present in this conference in Volos, and the late Metropolitan said that if he started all over again, the Eucharist would still be at the of his thought. Thank you very much for your kind words. Now, let's start our conference. Let's open the conference on the theological legacy and ecumenical vision, a conference in memory of Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon. I met him in Geneva many years ago, and almost until the end of his life, we were in the same parish, and he delivered many speeches, he officiated many divine liturgies. I have also shared many experiences with him in other parishes. He was always calm and some other priests wanted to hurry up, but he was always very slow, very calm with his words. Now I would like to give the floor to His All Holiness to deliver his opening speech. The title of this speech is The Theological Legacy of Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon. Please, the floor to you.
Once again, good evening. Welcome, you all. Honorable Eminencies, Your Excellencies, Honorable Archons, monks and nuns, if any, Your Eminencies, professors, male and female, and all other participants. Once again, brethren in Christ. We will cordially welcome at this international conference those who came from abroad and those who came from the city of Constantinople to honor the memory and contribution of the Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon, this great theologian, professor, and academic. He is offering to our church, to his sacred science, and to the spiritual world and culture. We especially thank the rapporteur, who shall present some central aspects of the work of the person in honor, who contribute in a catalytical way to the operation of theology as a theology in debate and dialogue, attesting that it can be a creative dialogue within the contemporary world, our culture, science, faithful, of course, to the tradition of our great fathers of the Church, who bequeathed us the model of open and dialogical theology. The late brother writes, what the late Greek philosophy was for the world of fathers of the Church, i.e. a world with which we had to dialogue and transform it, it is for today's orthodoxy the accelerating technical cultural time. Today's world is dominated by the achievements of the Western society, which range from the achievements of technology to the stress and loneliness, and the dehumanization and depersonalization of people, which is expressed so tragically via art in all of its forms. In this world, our modern orthodoxy must bend with a robust attitude and sensitivity in order to transform the modern philosophies and ideologies and save its person, its freedom from the vortex of today's richness. And of course, orthodoxy has all the arsenal to do this. Hidden in the liturgical and the ascetic experience of orthodoxy, these forces can be liberated and can create and establish a dialogue within our modern society in order to be able to transform it. Orthodoxy is the hope of the world in today's critical era. End of quote. This comes actually from the text from the late Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon. At that time, many Western theologians, in the face of the so-called penetrating tradition-timely thought of Pergamon, imposed the identification of orthodoxy with the incapacity of meeting the modern world, and actually turned themselves through the utilization of the theology of the Metropolitan of Pergamon to the study of the richness of our Orthodox tradition. In this regard, my humbleness noted the following in his greeting at his ordination at the Volos Academy of Theological Studies and his proclamation back in October 2011. I had said back then that the honored Metropolitan hierarch contributed in a decisive manner so that our Western Christianity could overcome the stereotype that the Orthodox Church is a place of traditionalism and introversion, and discover the treasures of today's living Orthodox tradition, the triune theology of our great Greek fathers, the patristic theory of the person as a testimony of relationship, the truth as a society, the Eucharist as part of the identity of the Church, and as, of course, the image of the eschaton, the role of the episcopal as the person who's responsible for this gathering and as a guarantor of the unity of our Church. The man as economist of the creation, the ascetic ethos of orthodoxy, and as a hope for today's world and people. The Metropolitan John Zizioulas Pergamon, he managed to underline the importance of the Orthodox theology and the society, and of course the culture and natural sciences and civilizations, in order to be able to face the ecological crisis and the protection of the environment, for dialogue, and of course through and with philosophy. That's what we had said back then in 2011. Just a few words comparing the value and the ethos of the Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon. Now, already back in 1971, I sincerely remember that the Ecumenical Patriarch Athinagoras firmly announced, wanted to propose to the Holy and Sacred Synod his election as hierarch. Furthermore, in 1974, the new Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios invited the professor at Fanari, here in Turkey, to be able to discuss his immediate elevation to the hierarchical office, after, of course, the decision that was taken by the Holy and Sacred Synod. In 1980, I undertook the initiative by the Metropolitan of Chalkidon Meliton. But once again, the candidate asked to be postponed. Finally, in 1986, already sick of the Metropolitan Meliton of Chalkidon, Sardis Maxim explicitly professed the issue of the election of Professor Zizioulas as a priest. Per the acceptance of this honorary proposal, the Holy and Sacred Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and of course the auspice of the Patriarch Demetrius, unanimously decided to include Professor Zizioulas in the holy clergy of the great Church, and subsequently the election and ordination of the Athron, as it's called, the so-called laity, as Metropolitan. The ordination of bishop took place on the Pentecost of 1986. Since then, and until his death on February 2nd, 2023, His Eminence, Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon, has successfully and effectively served our holy great Church of Christ from various high positions of responsibility, both as far as the inter-Orthodox relations are concerned and the inter-Christian dialogue, as well as in the witness of orthodoxy in today's world. He used to teach as a university professor and was a writer of major works that actually have shaped the identity of our modern theology. Texts that, as we all know, have been translated in different languages. Now, many and interesting things are to be articulated on part of the rapporteurs today, as far as the ecclesiastical and the witnessing of Pergamos John, who since 1983 was a a regular member of the Academy of Athens with an impressive footprint, acceptance, recognition, and contribution in this prestigious University of Greece. Once again, I'm referring, of course, to the Academy of Athens. And of course, we will have the opportunity to hear my dear friend and professor, His Honorable Academician, Mr. Paschalis Kitromilidis. Is Mr. Kitromilidis here? Is His Honorable Eminence here? Now, my humbleness will then selectively refer to some aspects of the witness of the testimony of the blessed brother, with a greater emphasis on the great author in our ecumenical patriarchate, for which he actually believed that he indelibly sealed not only the history of the Church, but also the very history of the so-called civilized humanity, and which continues to be to serve as hope for the present and the future of modern man. Allow me to add that this institution, the institution of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, even if we have not given it to us by the grace of God, to our nation, we should have invented it. Now, in this truly impressive speech at a synaxis of the archons of the Officali of the Throne in Athens, he mentioned the following blessed words. What is the Ecumenical Patriarchate? We call it institution. We qualify it as an institution, but it is much more than that. It is a historical paradox. It is one of the contemporary mysteries of history. Indeed, no historical institution was able to combine these different paradoxes as the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Especially if we trace back the events in history, we shall see a patriarch who enters with the emperor in Hagia Sophia for the divine liturgy that would be celebrated with such glory, with such splendor. We shall make in the 10th century the non-believers to embrace orthodoxy, because they could not discern whether earth or in heaven attending this magnificent and major event. A patriarchate which in 1453 was obliged to lose, along with the Byzantine Empire, the entirety of its glory, to see the Church of Hagia Sophia being converted in a Muslim mosque, and see its seat being moved, and nevertheless to undertake the leadership of all orthodoxy in the newly Ottoman Empire. Everything showed its end, and barely we managed to avoid the transfer of its seat via the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. But still, the moment arrives, the momentum arrives that the historical endeavors lead to waves of migration from Greece to Europe, to the United States, to Australia, and almost throughout the world. And the Ecumenical Patriarchate acquires once again a larger followers, believers throughout the Greek diaspora in replacement of what it had actually lost. So let us die, but also let us live. Furthermore, as poor, we become richer. But the question is, how? If an institution manages to survive historically only when it hears the vibrations and clashes of history, and it manages to respond to the existential needs of people at any given moment of the history, then the Ecumenical Patriarchate has even today and tomorrow a role to perform, a mission to perform. The Ecumenical Patriarchate proved that it can actually translate the past into present, the present into future, yesterday and today into tomorrow. And this is because, leaving aside its institutional status, it is a carrier of an openness, of a universality, and a sensitivity for man of all ages. And this is the so-called human guarantee for its future. End of quote. It is really characteristic that in his introduction titled Nation and Universe in the Consciousness of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Metropolitan of Pergamon underlines that any weakening of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in any kind of way is a weakening of our own nation. Now, this supreme institution of the Orthodoxy and the nation was served by our blessed brother, Metropolitan of Pergamon, with an admirable devotion. The contribution and his contribution to the ecumenical movement and the inter-Christian dialogue as an executive secretary of the so-called Faith and Order Division of the World Council of Churches. He managed to express and transfer his experience during the first year of his term of office as far as the presence of Orthodox theology in the World Council of Churches. Let us see the report that he had drafted addressed to the Ecumenical Patriarch Athinagoras on 1st June 1969. And he says, the work of an Orthodox in the eminently theological field of faith and order generates major and fundamental questions per the position and contribution of the Orthodox theology, generally speaking, in our days. Therefore, it becomes our greater consciousness that the Orthodox theology, leaving aside its confessional, polemical tone of the past, should be able to work with problems that are related to today's man, and thus contribute in a more creative way to building a true Christian unity. The phenomenon is momentous, as the General Assembly in Uppsala showed, as well as the experience of the teachers in all theological schools of the world. Now, the new generation is no longer interested about the theological challenges of the past and moves forward in some visionaries under the pressure of contemporary problems. Orthodox theology, especially the patristic theology, has always been pastoral, which means that our fathers do not simply theologize academically, as our theologians do today. They did not know special branches of theology. It was a unique, let's say, discipline. And today, Orthodox theology cannot leave the problems of today's man unanswered without betraying itself and the Church. Metropolitan of Pergamon served also as chair of the International Committee for the Official Theological Dialogue of the Orthodox Church with the Anglican Communion and the International Joint Committee for the Theological Dialogue between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. Through his positions, he managed to contribute to the progress of dialogue, always with a greater emphasis on the theological dimension as a pillar for a positive perspective. Theology is the heart of ecumenism, he notes. It is of particular importance to note that the Metropolitan of Pergamon, in this said text, he adds that ecclesiology is at the heart of ecumenism. This significance of this particular phrase is actually revealed through the words of our late Metropolitan of Pergamon in the discussion of the text of the Holy and Great Council on the relation of the Orthodox Church with the rest of the Christian world, talking about the unity of churches and unity of Christians. As long as we have a perspective of unity, we cannot ignore the canonical tradition nor the ecclesiological tradition. I think the reference must remain on ecclesiology and on the canon, because based on these texts we managed to move forward in our dialogues. The perspective of the dialogues is not the achievement of a unity which will not be determined by the ecclesiological and canonical tradition. It is important for us Orthodox to emphasize the following. In other words, that we see the future of the unity pass through the ecclesiological tradition of the Orthodox Church, and not to expect a unity which is unrelated to this tradition. So a unity that we look forward comes through the ecclesiological tradition of the Orthodox Church. This is very important. End of quote. The contribution of the Metropolitan Pergamon was great during the preparation and final phase of our journey towards the realization of the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church in 2016 in the island of Crete. That was a true breakthrough in the modern history of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. This was the institution of the synaxes of the Orthodox Fathers, who promoted the inter-Orthodox synergy and collaboration and accelerated the convocation of the Holy and Great Synod. It is no coincidence that the presidents of the Inter-Orthodox Preparatory Committee of the first synaxes of Orthodox primates in Fanari in 1992 was assigned by us, of course, to the late Metropolitan of Pergamon. I was a Metropolitan for 6 months, and I asked the late Metropolitan of Pergamon to visit all the autocephal churches and invite Metropolitans to gather to our first synaxes that took place in March 1922. And we had, on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, great liturgy, and we issued a text where we all tried to be able to hear the unique voice of Orthodoxy in the whole world. Now, as we were going towards the Synod of Crete, and all the preparatory events, our late brother was a charismatic theologian and consultant of my humbleness. I still remember his major interventions in the final formation of the said text as far as the relationship between the Orthodox Church with the other Christian dogma, and the great discussions we had in this particular says as far as the term church for the non-Orthodox. Those who were present in Crete, they still remember these, let's say, fervent discussions we had as far as the name, the person, and the human character. I guess we shall all hear about these things during the next presentations and the next days, the following days. Especially as far as the use of the word ecclesia, in other words, church, for non-Orthodox, and of course in other parts of his text. Now, a great witness as far as the deepness of the theology and knowledge of our late brother are, of course, the minutes of this event. I still remember the intervention of the Metropolitan of Pergamon when the issue was discussed as far as the use or not of the term prosopo, person. Now, and of course, whether it should be replaced by the word human or man. In the text, the mission of the Orthodox Church in the modern world. We present to you his decisive intervention, through which and thanks to which the term human person remained in this important synodical text, where we have said about that the Holy and Great Council would be worth convening only and simply to discuss this particular text. Metropolitan Pergamon said back then The question at this moment is whether it is permissible or not. If I would say, if it is required to use the term prosopo, person. It has been said that the term must be abolished totally from our terminology because some tend to misuse this term. I think we should not do that because as we use it on a daily basis, it is very important for us to be able to talk to our people, to use the language that the people wish and have learned to use. Now, as far as people's life is concerned, the word person, prosopo, is very important. And what I would like to say especially is that if we were to abolish this particular term in the name of our dialogue with our scientists, especially in questions of bioethics, we will have a major problem. Because let's not forget that for scientists, man is nothing but a living being. Now, if we further accept this view, then we cannot afford defending the sanctity of man unless we distinguish the term man from the term person, in other words, prosopo. This particular distinction already exists in the scientific jargon, and let's be honest that this particular term must be used in any synodical text that aspires to be read by the greater public. The later Florovsky has written that the greatest contribution of the patriarchal theology is the term of prosopo, person. It is therefore not possible to simply abolish this term because it can be, let's say, misinterpreted or misused by certain and lead to heresies, etc. So I insist, Your Holiness, that the abolition of this particular term creates a major problem in our relationship with science, with scientists, with the world outside the Church. And the Orthodox Church cannot afford close this communication line with the outside world just by saying that we are entering into a philosophical discussion instead of a theological one, which, of course, let's be honest, is not that conflictuary. If these two fields clash, then we cannot have any more a dialogue with the others except with certain theologians among us. Therefore, I believe that this matter is very serious, and per my opinion, the arguments that were listened against this thing have nothing to do with the use of the term in a rather broader sense. And this is how actually the Metropolitan of Pergamon closed his remarks back then. I guess that you are present, or those who were present back in the Synod, the intense fight, I dare to say, that there was between the Metropolitan of Pergamon with other Metropolitans and Holy Hierarchs on this particular topic, of course. Now, Metropolitan John of Pergamon highlighted the anthropological, cultural, and also ecological consequences and implications related to the loss of the concept of person and his identification with man in the Western world, and highlighted the importance of person, of prosopo, as being the human anthropology and ontology. During his first interview at the Kathimerini newspaper in September 1993, after his election as a regular member of the Academy of Athens, he said the following: an individual, a man, is a concept that is numerical, quantitative, and self-assumed. But the person, however, should not be understood as a single unit, but it is an amazing and unique entity which stems from the society as all others, and in theological language, with the word "see," which is, of course, God, you. Our modern civilization promotes at the highest ideal the happiness and the prosperity of individuals has created a rift between freedom and love. Either you will be free or you will love. But of course, freedom mainly means liberation from the limits of our ego. This is love. Only the one who manages to love is truly free. Today, people tend not to love because they're afraid one another. Orthodoxy has much to offer in this major issue if we manage to study in depth its theology and, of course, its historical tradition. This is the duty of the Orthodox theology, which is enormous. That's what he had said in his interview in Καθημερινή in September 1993. Your Holinesses, Your Excellencies, it is truly inconceivable to be able to talk about the theological legacy of the Metropolitan John of Pergamon, and of course not to make a reference to the Eucharist and the theological ecology in great. Metropolitan of Pergamon said the following: I remain unrepentant just for one thing in my theological journey: the Eucharist approach to theology. This particular approach remains, as far as I'm concerned, the only path that Orthodox theology has to follow if it wishes to truly face the challenges of our era. The Eucharist approach is not one-sided. The Eucharist approach is nothing more Catholic than this actual divine event, which is Eucharism. Now, this is where everything ends: baptism, repentance, art, and everything else that is included in the existence and the presence of life of a man, but also of the whole creation. Eucharist theology has a dynamic which is endless. Eucharist ecclesiology of Pergamon managed to be expressed via also the biblical contribution, and tradition is the greater contribution of the Orthodox theology in today's global theological dialogue. With a reference to the Divine Eucharist, our late brother also managed to draft his so-called theological ecology, ecological sensitivity, and the care for the protection of the natural environment is, let's say, the expansion of the Eucharist identity of the Church and the asceticism and the ascetic morals or ethos witness as a Eucharist use of the world. Now, the Orthodox ecclesiastical life is, as we say, can be qualified as applied ecology. Now, Pergamon says that the physical, the material world, bread, wine, colors, sounds, and all of our senses, sight, touch, smell, hearing, do participate in an inseparable unity. There is no contradiction between objective and subjective reality. There is no a conquering attitude on behalf of man against the world that actually surrounds him, as it is the case in technology. The world is not against, is not an opposed object. It does not go against humans, but it is perceived, it is united, it becomes a single body via the Holy Communion. Now, the Holy Communion is not just a sign of union with God and others, but also our intake of food, acceptance, recognition of our natural environment, and incorporation of the matter, and not the overuse of land and matter. Now, the sanctity that accompanies this attitude, the divinity that permeates this relationship, is the antipode of technology and the solution, of course, to our ecological problem. The Divine Eucharist is once again the most that one can offer via Orthodoxy to today's world. Once again, these were words by the late Metropolitan of Pergamon. Now, in perpetuity, the theological ecology will have the signature, the seal of John of Pergamon. There's no discussion of the contribution of Christianity to the protection of the natural environment without referring to the contribution positions of John of Pergamon. Now, it is a truly Eucharist experience that defines life through the hope of our late Metropolitan, is once again his eschatology. A life-giving, a nourisher, a legacy for future generations, a stimulus for fruitful theological discussion, an enduring possession for our sacred science. And once again, allow me to quote the late Metropolitan of Pergamon, eschatology is not just a teaching. It is a perspective. It is a way of being and living. It is not just about the future. It also touches on the past and our present. End of quote. These were the first, let's say, words of the major work of Pergamon, which was published after his death, under the title Remembering the Future Toward an Eschatological Ontology. Our blessed brother brought back at the center for Orthodox theology eschatology, developed the relevant authentic perspective and teaching, and managed also to criticize the different trends of theological and existential marginalization of a glorious presence of the Lord within the framework of Orthodoxy. And he writes, now the area of human life in which you had a great anticipation of the second coming, even if, of course, with full consciousness and its importance, it is the place of divine worship and especially, of course, divine Eucharist. Now, if we do remember of the history of salvation in the we pressure offer Eucharist gifts include not just, of course, Christ, not just the ascension to heaven, the resurrection, the tomb, but also the second and glorious presence. Now, during the Eucharist liturgy, the divine community remembers not just the past, but also the future. Now, in this context, in this framework, we need also to think about the role of our divine brother as far as the role of the preaching in divine liturgy. The positions are just afterwards this major text, as it used to happen in our church since the beginning. Now, the transfer of the sermon into the house of the social is an unacceptable alteration at the expense of Eucharist. Once again, the late Metropolitan of Pergamon says, and I quote, "The divine liturgy is, according to St. Maximus, a journey from history to eschaton." And actually, the preaching necessarily transfers and talks us back to history. This is a, let's say, revolution against the whole meaning of the divine liturgy and must be amended as rapidly as possible. Now, the position of the liturgy requires to be a word of supplication, and it is not possible within the Eucharist liturgy, which actually conveys and incarnates the love and mercy of God to all, even the one of sinners, for preaching to be denouncing. Now, Pergamon, in his works, in his books, talks about this change of the position of preaching, reiterating that in this way we manage to reverse the role of Eucharist as an image of the kingdom. It is revealing, as he says, the argument that has been used to justify the misplacement and rather novel introduction in our century, a transfer of liturgy from its natural position after the rendering of the gospel to the time of the Now the argument that the Church has gathered more testifies that the missionary or the pastoral criterion has prevailed over the structural and iconological. And this actually will alter the image of the kingdom, will reverse the whole movement and course from history to kingdom. And it is as if we are, let's say, playing Act 1 of a drama after the last. The eschatological orientation of our ecclesiastical life determines and highlights the position of asceticism for the faithful. Eschaton is present within history, but not in its fullness. As long as there is still death, and we look forward to the resurrection, we are foretold in the kingdom in the divine Eucharist, but we are called to fight against evil in the world. And of course, we need ascesis. The Church moves between ascesis and Eucharist. These are essential for the Church. There can be no Church without asceticism, because that would actually mean that the evil has already been defeated. The divine Eucharist that actually is, let's say, a starter to this world is actually a joy. And so according to Pergamon, the eschatological nature of our Church is present in both cases. But while asceticism is a temporary victory against evil, the foretaste of the kingdom via the divine Eucharist makes it clear that evil will be defeated once and for all in the kingdom of Christ. This means that the orientation towards eschatological victory against evil is the driving force for asceticism and for the liturgical life. My dear guests, my dear fellows, it was not long ago that His Holiness Pope Francis of Rome named the Metropolitan of Pergamon as the greatest theologian, and I quote, of modern history. I was there and I heard when it was mentioned in Hierosolima. Moreover, Professor Christos Gianaras described the theological statute of Pergamon as being similar to the decisive compositions of Orthodox self-consciousness of the year of our fathers, attributing to him the title of, and I quote, the most important Orthodox theologian after Gregorios Palamas of course, the ecclesiastical period. Indeed, nothing in the field of Orthodox theological testimony since 1965, the year when it was published, his pioneer doctoral thesis under the title The Unity of the Church in the Divine Eucharist and the Bishop during the first 3 centuries. So since then and until today, this cannot be understood without reference to the work, to the readings, to the books, and of course the doctoral thesis of the Metropolitan of Pergamon. The most important aspect in Orthodox theology was the meeting of Hellenism and Christianity, the return to our fathers, the Eucharist ecclesiology, highlighting the role of the bishop as the primate of the divine Eucharist, that no divine liturgy is conceivable without reference to the bishop in whose name it is actually performed. referring to the institutional side of the ecclesiology against the charismatic element, and those who forget that orthodoxy is a community with a particular structure, that the Church holds the truthfulness not simply in its teachings, but also in its structure, especially highlighting the importance of ecclesiology for the whole of theology and for the existential understanding and interpretation of our doctrine, the concept of the person as the quintessence of the patristic anthropology, and the great theological composition with eschatology constitute, let's say, the heart, the nucleus of the contemporary Orthodox offering, not just in the area of church, but also in the dialogue with philosophy, with art, in our, let's say, encounter with our natural, technological, and social sciences, as well as with the widest field of culture. It can be said that numerous doctoral dissertations and studies that have been drawn up until our days for Pergamon theology, and the fact that there is globally no serious theological paper which does not have a reference to John Zizioulas, is a great introduction to what will follow in the future as far as the influence of the theological thinking of the late Metropolitan John of Pergamon. Indeed, the theology of Metropolitan Pergamon is a breakthrough to the course of theological events of our time. As it has already been said, we talk about the pre-Pergamon and post-Pergamon era of our theology. Now, in the following years, there will be no serious theology which will not be inspired, which will not be sourced from the teachings and the books of our blessed late Father. Now, the Holy Great Church is praised, is blessed by God to have in her ranks of its bishops this major, I dare to say, eagle of theology, Metropolitan John of Pergamon, with its dynamic presence in ecumenical meetings, a major negotiator who was invited to undertake some very, very difficult ecclesiastical missions, initiator, a chairman of the different conferences and special committees where he presided. He was called upon to bring and express his ecclesiological opinion on major current ecclesiastical issues, that he always did thoroughly and, of course, with his theological knowledge and insight. Now, in our archives, the archives of our synod, we do have his texts, his opinions, his interventions, his proposals, and other major texts that are one of the most valuable theological repositories that we could ever wish to have. Now, our blessed late brother had great respect to the Ecumenical Patriarchate and, of course, its ecclesiological identity. He emphasized contribution to the pan-Orthodox unity, to the inter-Christian and inter-religious dialogue, his resistance to the different religious, ethnic and racial trends within Orthodoxy, his contribution to the world, and as far as the different events of time. Now, our blessed brother showed that the authentic theological work is one of the most exciting adventures of humans. That was his own words, actually. It is not coincidence that his texts are characterized by an incomparable timelessness. They place the truth of our faith in the relevance of the present as living evidence that there is no dogma of our church that has nothing to say about the real problems of man. The theological legacy of the late Metropolitan John of Pergamon is his own words, his own thing, his theological theology, as it's called, which interprets with existential terms, historical framework, a theology which has a double reference, the faithfulness to truthfulness and the openness. Now, to conclude, we bow before the greatness and the ecclesiastical and theological offer of our late brother, Metropolitan John of Pergamon. We praise him, we love him, in the name of the Lord, in the name of life and death, that he may rest his soul in Lord, in peace, and of course to be resurrected in the kingdom of our times, where, as he believed, the divine Eucharist will be the only ecclesiastical event that will be able to survive. Thank you for your presence, for your participation, and we are reassured that today's conference will be, for all of us, a source of spiritual enrichment and especially a love for Metropolitan John of Pergamon that left so much to our church, to our civilization. This amazing academician, Metropolitan of Pergamon, John Zizioulas. In this spirit, we bestowed upon you the blessing of the Holy Great Church of Christ, invoking upon each one of you the grace and the illumination of the Comforter, the spirit of wisdom and compassion.
Thank you, Your Holiness. Indeed, the elder of Pergamon was exactly as you described him. Everything you said are unique, and they highlight yet again the greatness of his personality. Since 1965, as you said, up to today, all his texts are fresh, are relevant, and this is very rare, a very rare case for all academics. His book, Remembering the Future, is a fresh, full of hope. Sometimes he asked me to fetch a book for him that had just been published, and he was always very happy, as children are happy when you bring them toys. He was a very lively person, a person who enjoyed being up to date, reading, studying, and when he was talking to us, when he was communicating with us, he was always theologizing. I'm grateful to him. And 15 years ago, I dedicated a book to him. And I have always and will always be a great admirer of the late Metropolitan of John. We will have a very short break, but now representing the Center of Orthodox of Orthodox Studies at the University of and co-organizer to deliver a short opening speech. Professor.
Sorry for my lateness, because I flew in today from New York and the plane was a bit late. So Your All Holiness, Your Eminences, fellow colleagues and friends, I greet you on behalf of my colleague, Dr. George Dimokopoulos. Together we co-direct the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University, and in many ways we feel that what we do there embodies and continues the spirit of course, the great theologian that we're commemorating here at this conference, the Metropolitan John Zizioulas. So it's really a great honor for us to be part of this organizing committee and to be a part of this really historic week. So we're looking forward to the conference. So thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Διάλειμμα περίπου 15 λεπτών.
Now we will have a 15-minute break. Just a few words from Mr. Kalaitsidis. Yes, I would like to apologize because in my opening remarks I omitted to convey the blessings of the Metropolitan of Dimitrias. He would like to be there, but because of the regular synod of the Council in Athens, he couldn't attend. Thank you.
Οι ομιλητές είναι ενώπιόν σας, ο πατήρ Δημήτριος Λινός, στη συνέχεια ο κύριος Νικόλαος Ασπρούλης και εν συνεχεία ο πατήρ Νικόλαος Σαχάροφ. Ξεκινάμε με τον καθηγητή πρωτοπρεσβύτερο Δημήτριο Λινό. Από το 1921 το Δεκέμβριο ανήκει στον Ιερό Κλήρο της Εκκλησίας της Ελλάδος, διάσημος καθηγητής, ομότιμος καθηγητής χειρουργικής ιατρικής του Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών, πρόεδρος της χειρουργικής του ομίλου Υγεία με πάρα πολλές διακρίσεις, ειδικός στην ενδοκρινική χειρουργική, θηροειδούς, επινεφριδίων κτλ. Με χιλιάδες εγχειρήσεις, μέχρι και εμένα έχει εγχειρήσει κάποτε πριν 20 χρόνια σε κάτι. Αλλά νομίζω ο μεγαλύτερος τίτλος τιμής για τον Δημήτριο Λινό είναι ότι είναι κληρικός και είναι αυτή τη στιγμή πρωτοπρεσβύτερος και λειτουργεί στον Ιερό Ναό των Αγίων του Αγίου Ανδρέου, ναι, στο κτήμα, στο Άλσος Συγκρού στην Αθήνα. Έχετε το λόγο.
Παναγιώτατε Οικουμενικέ Πατριάρχα και Αρχιεπίσκοπε Κωνσταντινουπόλεως κύριε Βαρθολομαίε, σεβασμιότατοι και ιερότατοι αρχιερείς, πανασιολογιότατοι και δεσιμολογιότατοι αδελφοί, αγαπητοί πατέρες, μητέρες, σεβαστοί καθηγητές, καθηγήτριες, συνάδελφοι, αγαπητοί φοιτητές, εκλεκτοί εισηγητές του συνεδρίου, υψηλοί προσκεκλημένοι, κυρίες και κύριοι, να ευχαριστήσω την Οργανωτική Επιτροπή του Διεθνού Συνεδρίου εις μνήμην του μακαριστού Μητροπολίτου Περγάμου και ακαδημαϊκού κυρού Ιωάννου Ζιζιούλα και την τιμή να περιληφθώ ως ομιλητής με θέμα γνωστές και άγνωστες προσωπικές στιγμές του Μητροπολίτη Περγάμου Ιωάννη Ζιζιούλα. Πολλοί είναι αυτοί που γνώρισαν από κοντά κάποιες από τις προσωπικές στιγμές του Μητροπολίτη Περγάμου Ιωάννη Ζιζιούλα, λαϊκοί, όπως ο κύριος Ανδρέας Γούλας, για τον οποίο ο δεσπότης έλεγε «Ο Ανδρέας ήταν το καλύτερο δώρο του Θεού προς εμένα», αλλά και κληρικοί, στους οποίους θα αναφερθώ αργότερα. Θα περιοριστώ ωστόσο κυρίως στη δική μου μικρή σχετικά εμπειρία, αλλά και στις συζητήσεις που κατά καιρούς είχα με αυτούς που τον γνώριζαν για μεγαλύτερο χρονικό διάστημα. Το Μητροπολίτη Περγάμου συνάντησα πριν 3 χρόνια ως γιατρός για τα συγκεκριμένα του προβλήματα τότε. Τα τέλη του 2021 νοσηλεύτηκε στο Θεραπευτήριο Υγεία με κλινική εικόνα οξείας χολοκυστίτιδας. Στην αρχή τον αντιμετωπίσαμε συντηρητικά, λόγω της σοβαρής καρδιακής του ανεπάρκειας και πήρε εξιτήριο συνεχίζοντας να παίρνει φάρμακα και αντιβίωση στο σπίτι χωρίς να υποστεί χειρουργική επέμβαση. Όμως, 4 μήνες αργότερα η κλινική του εικόνα χειροτέρεψε και υποχρεωθήκαμε να προχωρήσουμε σε εγχείρηση λαπαροσκοπικής χολοκυστεκτομής, η οποία πήγε πολύ καλά και ο Μητροπολίτης επέστρεψε σπίτι του μετά από λίγες μέρες.
It went very well, and the Metropolitan went back home a few days later. I was already impressed by his strength and his response to the medical problems he was experiencing. But the problem of his heart failure with dyspnea and swelling in feet continued, making the quality of his life hard. Treatment with diuretics that his cardiologists insisted on giving to him, a very well-known professor of cardiology who died a few months later, made it even worse. Then we were faced with a dilemma of conducting a surgery for his destroyed aortic valve. The reasonable answer was that a 93-year-old man with such a serious heart problem should not be operated on. So there was the suggestion of the transcatheter aortic valve implantation. So a catheter is inserted through the leg and a new valve replaces the damaged one. Then the cardiac surgeons told me, "You will kill him." But my suggestion was that he should dare to move on, because his alternative was to die a few weeks later, according to the experts. He did not rush into making the decision himself, but he studied carefully, as he always did, both sides, both arguments. I would like to say that the intervention and recommendation of the Ecumenical Patriarch for the Professor Dangas at Newark was decisive, because he had personal experience when not long ago in New York, with an emergency coronary angioplasty, he managed to continue his impressive work around the world. At the end of April 2022, the Metropolitan of Pergamon was lying on the surgery table, mildly sedated. The team of experts of the YEA hospital, under the guidance of Professor Dangas, started the operation by inserting stents from the femoral vein and the percutaneous introduction of the aortic valve in place of the old one. When after an hour the heart had to stop beating for a while to start beating again with a new valve, something happened that scared me. I saw the patient jumping up, and the doctors were shouting for the placement of an intra-aortic balloon pump for the temporary function of the heart. I thought that it was all over, and I went out to tell Andreas that we unfortunately lost him. But I forgot, again, the Metropolitan's hidden tremendous resuscitation power. Indeed, when a few minutes later I returned to the operating room, the despot's heart was beating just fine with the help of his new artificial valve. His post-surgery course was splendid, and he went back to his home in Kifissia. He insisted, using various excuses, to ignore our recommendations to hire a specially trained nurse who would serve him on a daily basis. For the bishop, Andreas was the best nurse. So he started going out again, walking about. He would come on Sundays to our chapel in Agios Andreas in Sigrou Forest. This church was built in 1780 by Ernestos Schiller, and it is the only Orthodox church of Gothic rhythm in Greece. It belongs to the Institute of Agricultural Studies of the Ministry of Agriculture, which is hosted nearby. Every Sunday, after the reading of the Gospel, there are lectures by theology professors such as the late Christos Giannaras, but also speeches in the rooms of the nearby tower. And they are moderated by distinguished professors such as Professor Yagazoglou, who is the moderator of these lectures. The Metropolitan of Pergamon quite often honored us with his presence. He was attending the Eucharist from the throne of the church, and he let me read the prayers before the communion. But he always said on his own, "Master who loves mankind, Lord Jesus Christ, my God, do not let these holy things be to me for judgment because of my unworthiness." After the end of the divine liturgy, he would go outside the church, he would distribute gifts, but mainly he was discussing with the other believers, to whom we offer coffee and sandwiches. He particularly enjoyed the salmon sandwich, but quite recently I found out that he did not like coffee, which he was very discreet never to tell me. And I want to talk about this discretion. I will tell you a story that Andreas confided in me. They once visited the house of a lady who had invited them for dinner. Some of his entourage reacted politely to the lady's proposal for non-lentil food that she had prepared on that Friday. And they asked for something else, a Lenten recipe. And the lady returned to the kitchen to prepare it for them, while they were scolded by the bishop for their attitude. So, nobility, the magnificence of the Metropolitan of Pergamon is acknowledged by all those who have met him, who had met him. However, he was distrustful when it came to the things they were telling him. In our almost daily communication for medical reasons, I was always impressed by the careful reading of the results of his tests. He wanted to read them himself, he wanted to keep copies, and he distrusted our general answers, such as "they're good, your tests are good." He wanted rigorous scientific and accurate answers to all his medical questions that doctors usually don't have. His memory, he always remembered our answers of the previous days, so that did not allow us to say anything that it was not 100% correct. The bishop demanded seriousness and accuracy of speech from all the people talking to him. That's why everything he said was always serious and accurate, even when you didn't understand it at first. For example, I would like to mention his insistence on condemning the view that liturgical vestments should not be gold-plated, but more simple. In the beginning, I was also in favor of that view, because of the supposed simplicity and humility of the vestments of the clergy. However, the theological and, might I say, persistent arguments of the Metropolitan of Pergamon finally convinced the opposing opinions of priests and non-priests when we participated in long, friendly meetings in our homes where various difficult issues were put to him. The bishop supported truly and silently, especially young people whom he believed had something to offer to society. Incidentally, I would say that he was very strict, and he did not promote people whose scientific and theological presence did not approve, even if they had achieved great recognition by the many. His Eminence, the Metropolitan Maximus of Silivria, recently confided in me how much the Metropolitan of Pergamon supported him with his letters of recommendation in order for him to be accepted by the Greek boarding schools, to be able to leave due to his difficult financial situation, but also to be accepted as a postgraduate student in England in renowned universities. In fact, when they met at the Essex monastery, he always secretly gave him money for his studies. So he was a merciful bishop who made sure that his right hand did not know what his left hand was giving. In a report, in an article that I authored in the newspaper of Καθημερινή, I referred to an investigation by a well-known English newspaper that accused psychiatrists for overprescribing drugs for mild melancholia. The reaction of a Greek professor of psychiatry was so exaggerated that the Hellenic Psychiatric Society was forced to denounce my text publicly. Fortunately, I managed to author a strict response that did not accept the content of the denunciation. Our texts were published next to each other in the next Καθημερινή paper. When we met in the same afternoon, he told me in a loud voice, loud and stern voice. What you wrote was to the point. I felt supported by him when I was attacked by my opponents. The bishop knew how to be silent when himself was attacked, but he was not afraid to support his friends when they were attacked. In one of our first meetings in his apartment in Kifisia, I dared to bring him some of his books that were printed abroad, and I asked him, instead of usual dedication, to write something very short about each book. Many months later, I thought that he had forgotten it. He told me, "Come tomorrow and I will return your books to you." Indeed, on the next day, he gave me back the books with his handwritten notes in each one of them. And allow me now to show you these handwritten notes. Here are his letters. In his first book, Being as Communion, he says, "God is one, but he is not alone. This is what our faith in the triune God states, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The importance of this faith for our existence is enormous. Individualism turns out to be a big lie. Nothing exists on itself. The entire existence, not only of man, but of the entire nature, is an event of communion. Love is the warp that holds and unites all existence. Outside of love and without love, nothing truly exists. Being is communion." In the second book, The Eucharistic Communion and the Word, he writes, "The entire world is one liturgy, one Eucharist. In divine liturgy, God invites us to a large supper hosted by His Son. Everybody participates in this supper, not only our loved ones, dead and living ones, but also the entire creation, in order to communicate its goods and thank the Creator. The entire creation thus becomes one divine liturgy." In his third book, Communion and Otherness, he writes, "Amor ergo sum, I am loved, therefore I am." That's the subject of the book. The Cartesian doctrine, cogito ergo sum, is overturned. My existence is due to the existence of someone else, ultimately the preeminent other, God. I exist because there is someone else who wants me to exist. This other is ultimately God, but also every other who loves us. In the fourth book, priests of creation, he writes, "The ecological problem is not an ethical problem. It is a problem of ethos. There is a large difference between these two terms. Ethics is a system of principles and rules that reason elaborates and establishes. Ethos is a way of relation to which we are addicted from a young age, the way in which we grew up. Our relation with the natural environment is something for which we grew up, an ethos of respect and love, depending which is proportional to the ethos we acquire in our social relations. We acquire this relation and we bring it with us from a young age, as we used to learn to go to the Divine Liturgy every Sunday. It is in the background, the ethos that the Divine Eucharist carries with it. In these handwritten notes, we can see, apart from his ability to condense in just a few words his answers to huge theological and social questions, we can also discern his personal kindness, politeness, subtleness. He thought it was impolite to communicate through emails. He thought that it was respectful to write in hand using a fountain pen and ink. This portrait of the Metropolitan of Pergamon has been painted by Bishop Maximus Vassilievich, who was one of his most trusted students. For this painting, another dear friend of his, Father Stamatis Clearis, wrote, there is an invisible axis connecting the look of the Metropolitan with the spectator, together with the wrinkles on his forefront. It is like stopping time, and he doesn't look only at us. He permits us, and he's looking inside our souls to find out something that is hidden. It is as if asking, "Are you there, dear spectator? Is this relationship real?" So he allows for a hope to emerge in this relationship with the eyes that brings us in a true relationship. It's a so-called, a truly eschatological and loving relationship of persons. I would like to continue talking about how the Metropolitan was treating the international publications of his books. The Metropolitan Maxim was his academic collaborator throughout these years, up to his death and afterwards. So 15 years ago, they started discussing the publication of his book, Remembering the Future. In a visit to Athens, the Metropolitan of Pergamon told him, "I should first finish the book Communion and Otherness, and after that we will publish Remembering the Future," for which he had already signed with the publishing house T. Clark, which is considered one of the most important publishing houses in the world in matters of theology, and had already sent most of the material, but some chapters and some final corrections were missing. In fact, the publishing house advertised this new book as coming soon, and many of his admirers had already paid in advance for the purchase of the book, but its publication was delayed, and these advance payments had to be returned. In one of the Metropolitan Maximus often visited the Metropolitan of Pergamon in his apartment in Kifisia to put pressure on him to complete this project, this book. The Metropolitan's apartment was full of books and notes everywhere, not only on the dining table, also in the kitchen and on the floor. In order to discuss his medical issues with him, we had to carefully step through the stacks of books to discover some empty seat on the old sofa and the few chairs he had in his apartment. In one of these visits, the always polite and discreet Maxim asked him, "When will you finish the book, Your Eminence?" And he replied, "I hope before the second coming." The truth is that the Metropolitan of Pergamon was constantly editing the text and confided in Maximus his thoughts on the rest of the content of the book, suggesting that he reflect on his bold idea that the future pre-exists the past. As you know, finally, this book, prefaced by Pope Francis, was published by Sebastian Press after his death posthumously in 2023. Last Friday, the Italian edition was published by an important Italian publishing house, as I was informed by another friend of the Metropolitan of Pergamon, Mr. Nikos Zoidis. As he said, the publishing house let me know that there is a huge interest in this book because the English edition has already been established as a point of reference for theological studies. The Cardinal Walter Casper, after reading the English version, said that he considers this book to be the most important book that he read in the past 10 years. Cardinal Koch said that this book is the culmination of the philosophy and theology. Pope Francis, as Mr. Zoidis says, said the following: Bartholomew is one of the great figures of history, but the late Zizioulas was a source of inspiration for all of us. He also said that during the elaboration of the encyclical Laudato Si, he was in constant communication with the Metropolitan of Pergamon. In his public speeches, Pope Francis makes references to John Zizioulas, and he did that recently during the Council of Vaticano in October. He made a reference to the concepts of bishop and local church as formulated by the Metropolitan of Pergamon. In another point, Mr. Zoidis says that he strictly highlighted that we shouldn't be captives of our history. History is time, and time identifies with death. We cannot live for and with the past. The Byzantine Empire is over, but the life and the future of man are the eschaton. This is why the Pope, in his preface for Remembering the Future, stressed that history must follow the man towards the eschaton and not dictate the course. I would like to conclude this short speech for the unknown aspects of the last month of his life, when the Metropolitan of Pergamon proved to be a person of patience and he accepted the will of God. His clinical condition kept improving, but suddenly, and despite the precautions, he had coronavirus, he contracted coronavirus, and he had to be hospitalized in a COVID unit. So he was in the Sismanoglio State Hospital, where we managed to find a single bedroom for the elder. Thankfully, all physicians and nurses had a very loving behavior towards him. Andreas was always by his side, and he left the hospital for just a few hours. However, he had to be hospitalized in the intensive care unit, although he was not intubated. He could not stand this complete isolation. So when his condition improved, he put pressure on me in order to return to his single bedroom. On Friday, January 27, 2023, Andreas called me and told me, His Eminence asked you to come and bring your epitrachilion. Indeed, I went there. I was wearing my epitrachilion. He sent Andreas away and he requested to confess. I obeyed, and I had no previous similar experience. I listened to him, I read him the forgiving wish, and we arranged on the next day to come and commune him. Indeed, on Saturday, I attended the Matins and the Divine Liturgy of the Patriarchal Church of the Ascension in Vyronas, and I received the body and blood and Christ in order to bring the communion to the Metropolitan of Pergamon. And I asked him, Your Eminence, should I come tomorrow on Sunday for the communion? And he said it won't be necessary. And I was curious and impressed about it. A few hours later, after he received the Holy Communion and I had already left, he fell into severe respiratory failure. He was intubated and was transferred to the ICU. He remained intubated until Wednesday, when he died peacefully between Andreas and the medical staff whom he loved so much. I then realized that already in our previous discussion, when he told me that it won't be necessary for me to come on the next day, he knew about his upcoming death. It was the 2nd of February 2023. While he was still in the ICU, I read the Trisagion and we all left the hospital with the certainty that he was indeed another saint in the arms of Christ. On March 12, 2023, in Agios Andreas, the Church of Agios Andreas, we held his 40-day memorial service. Immediately afterwards, in the adjacent hall, we held an event to pay honor to him in memory of this modern father of our church. Professors Kornarakis and Yagazoglou moderated this meeting, always together with Andreas. He's in the corner, as you might be able to see him. Personally, and I guess this is the case for most of you, I still feel him by me as a teacher, mentor, guide, spiritual father, through his texts and through what we have gained from our various conversations. We were blessed enough to be able to talk to him. Eternal memory. Thank you. Thank you, Father Dimitrios. I would like to say a few words about Andreas. It was the person that was always by his side, accompanying him. And let me give you an anecdotal story. My wife and me were supposed to go to the memorial service of Father Skouteris in 2009, if memory serves me right. So we went to pick him up. We called him, and he was on the balcony, and he said, I'm coming down. But then the balcony door was closed, and he was wearing just a shirt. And he gave us the telephone of Andreas. We waited for half an hour. Andreas came. He had a spare key, so he unlocked the door, and we managed to save him. Another time, he was down with flu, down with fever, and he called him, and I asked him, should my wife prepare a soup for you? And he said, no, only Andreas. Indeed, Andreas, and Mr. Yagazoglou confirmed it, was the only one who had his mobile phone. Thank you very much. Thank you for everything you've shared with us. And now the floor to Dr. Nikolaos Asproulis, one of the most dynamic and powerful theologians of the younger era. His postgraduate degree was, and his dissertation was, on the theology of the Metropolitan of Pergamon. And he is the expert of comparing these two major theologians. He is the Deputy Director of the Academy of Theological Studies of Volos, and a very active and prolific writer. Mr. Asproulis, the floor to you.
Comments of microphone cannot be translated. Please kindly ask from the speaker to turn off his microphone. Speaker off microphone. Your Royal Holiness, Excellencies, Eminencies, ladies and gentlemen. Now, talking about the person and the work of this leading theologian and thinker is not an easy endeavor. We need a careful study and respect for the approach of the text, without, of course, lacking a critical eye that preserves the seriousness of any relevant project. In fact, if one is invited to bring together in dialogue the two leading Orthodox theologians of our time, Father Georgios Florovsky and Metropolitan Zizioulas of Pergamon, the above task becomes even more difficult, to the extent that the critical confrontation of the thinking is related to the essentials of theology. Well, it gives us the framework and the outline of the present and future of Orthodox theology. In this presentation, I will first attempt to bring into dialogue two basic texts of the two theologians, which define their theological methodology and thematic: Christ and the Church of Christ and His Church by Florovsky, and the mystery of the Church in the Orthodox tradition by Zizioulas, in order to then see, as far as possible, continuities and discontinuities between the two thinkers. In other words, the internal variety and dynamics of the so-called neo-patristic theology model, but also the paths that are to be opened towards the creation of an orthodox systematic theology for the 21st century. So let's start with the dialogue of these two theologians via these two texts. Bringing to mind the titles of these texts, it becomes immediately obvious the point that decisively differentiates the two perspectives. On the one hand, the Christ and His Church by Florovsky, and as the universal mystery of Christ in its individual phases, is placed opposite to the mystery of the Church by Zizioulas as the predominantly and exclusive prism of viewing the meaning and understanding the truth of the entire divine economy. Now, as for Zizioulas, the importance is a particular phase of the plan of the divine economy, the Church being an autonomous, in some way, object of investigation. For Florovsky, the focus seems to be wider, as the Church is completely dependent on it and cannot be considered as the very object of theological reflection. In the perspective of relating an ecclesiastical view of the whole of reality, both theologians are interested in defining more or less in advance the methodological prerequisites, the so-called French principles, according to Florovsky, or the theological prerequisites, according to Zizioulas, of theology. This happens in spite of the fact that Florovsky will insist on a rather ecclesiastical, rather ecclesiological view of things, and an attempt to interpret hermeneutics, the whole economy. In other words, Zizioulas focuses on the very identity of the Church, while Florovsky more and more focuses on the ecclesiastical character of the theological way. Now, when reading these two texts, we can further identify the deep differentiation that characterizes the two thinkers, while Florovsky finally inscribes his theology in the biblical, historical, soteriological perspective. In the case of Zizioulas, it seems that the search for points of contact and dialogue with the secular philosophy is primarily attempted, in the perspective of elaborating a shared existential way for the world and the Church, in the framework of the relational ontology. The issue in this case is not the hermeneutics of the Church in the perspective of biblical revelation as the only starting point of theology, as Florovsky does, but the exemption of the theological self-consciousness from individual-centered trends that suggest a fragmented conception and interpretation of reality in favor of a relational approach of the being. Now, this basic methodological differentiation becomes further apparent when it's found that while Florovsky sets as a starting point and framework of his theological reflection the person, prosopo, and work of Jesus Christ, Zizioulas, for his part, in the perspective of ontological interest, links very closely the discourse of the Church with its triune theology, ultimately with the real ontology. If Florovsky uses and utilizes as a whole his work as image of Christ, as the body of Christ, as the most appropriate, at least in its mature work, that the mystery of Christ in all its individual phases, it's the only starting point for viewing the Church of the economy as a whole. Zizioulas will highlight the importance of the equally biblical image of the Christ as the Church of God in order to point out the implicit, close interconnection and interrelation and starting point from the triune God, and particularly the existential way of the Church as a communion of persons with a personal way of existence of the Holy Trinity, once again as a communion of persons, as well as the preliminary starting point of the no reflection of the Christian meaning of the economy, ecclesiological view. Now, it appears by these two texts that basically questions and concerns the two thinkers is quite different. While for Florovsky, this concerns in about who Jesus Christ is and how this is related to his church, but also to the divine economy. In the case of Zizioulas, through the exploration of some basic theological prerequisites, like a Trinitarian starting point, the spiritual formation, the eschatological opening, and refractionality and cosmological dimension, which concerns the contemplation and formation of the identity of the classical event. The central question for Zizioulas has to do with the identity of the Church itself, as the exclusive and predominant place of manifestation and hermeneutics of the entire divine plan. In the perspective of exploring this basic question, Florovsky will point out that the starting point and foundation of the Church can only be the one-off, individual, salvific historical events of the personal, specific history of Jesus Christ, who, although he is the ego, the head of the body, in no way consorts with him, abandoning, in that case, his own, at the same time, glorious humanity. On the other hand, in Zizioulas, based on the liturgical Eucharistic experience, which is the most appropriate criterion of theology, Jesus Christ should in no way be understood in distinction from his body, i.e., the one at a distance from the many, but himself as an inclusive personality, as a church, which is not only the mediator between God and creation, but also the prism of understanding and interpreting the entire economy. It would be not an exaggeration to assume that the position and role of the great high priest and mediator between God and creation seem to have been taken by Florovsky as Jesus Christ, who is still mysteriously present in his ecclesiastical body, as the sacraments and especially baptism, Eucharist, in a sequence with Nicholas Kabasilas, make Jesus Christ himself present and active. And in Zizioulas, this position seems to have been fully occupied by the fact that the role of the Church, which through the Eucharist constitution and its charismatic institutions, more or less substitutes for the undisputed mediator role of the head of the Church, to the extent that in this case, the sacraments, or rather exclusively the Eucharist, realize and reveal, let's say eschatologically primarily, the very fact of the Church itself, rather than make Jesus Christ present in history. Utilizing as starting point the two basic texts, we further understand the broader distinction between theological academism and ecclesiastical theology, which goes beyond extreme rationalism, maintaining the rational negotiation of the historical apocalyptic event, according to Florovsky, or the Eucharist, self-consciousness and foretaste of the eschatological kingdom by the members of Ecumenical according to Zizioulas. Depending on the way of viewing, the Church as ecclesiastical work is understood either as a theology of history, which reflects on the perspective of the events of the history of salvation, as it was recorded, of course, in the Holy Bible, and acted in the so-called Lord's body, according to Florovsky, having a predominantly interpretative work, or attempts through the interpretative or hermeneutic dissection of the dogmatic terms of faith to correlate the ecclesiastical tradition with the existential quests of neoteristic people, to the extent that this actually preaches the preventive renovation, if we dare to say, perspective of the eschatological emergence of the truth of beings according to Zizioulas. Finally, the work of both theologians through this unquestionably theological hermeneutic approach to the history of theology attempts to restore, attempts to heal the organic interconnection between church and theological discourse, the emergence of the ecclesiastical character of theology, according to the example of the Fathers, while avoiding a so-called theology of repetition or a theology that is not able to provide to each human being a new proposition of life. Now, some extensions for the future of Orthodox theology, according to these theologians. There is no need to make a specific reference to the unparalleled intra-Orthodox and ecumenical importance of the work of the two theologians. In fact, Florovsky's work, as it is conceded, largely has determined the course and problematic to date of modern Orthodox theology. On the other hand, Zizioulas' theological thought has more or less determined the content of the ecclesiological dialogue between East and West, to the extent that he was once considered to be the English Pope, due to the influence that he had, and he still has, if I dare to say, via his thoughts, in the Anglo-Saxon world. What we should further underline at this point is that Florovsky and Zizioulas are, in many different ways, theologians of the one Holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. In other words, theologians who theologize with a view to Christian unity as the una sancta according to eschatology. There are theologians who explain the ecclesiastical tradition, who interpret the history of theology not through an ideological type and discourse between East and West, but in its own way. The body of Christ, the soteriological implications for the whole world and the whole creation. As they attempt to, let's say, translate according to Zizioulas or preach according to Florovsky, anew the ecclesiastical experience and the apostolic faith in the present, both theologians express in a more faithful or not way aspects of the Orthodox ethos, next to the sense patrasi. While being in a constant dialogue and debate with their surroundings, they listen to the problems of the people, avoiding to change, without of course missing some failures, orthodoxy into any ideology that serves psychological, cultural, national, ideological or other needs. Through this careful and in-depth study of their entire work, focusing on the two texts that I mentioned, it becomes clear that though both theologians indirectly or directly fight for the essentials of theology, they have a different methodology and a different starting point of theology, though sometimes one might see some coincidence on some views as far as the creation according to theology. At this point, one might realize and say and wonder how these two different methodological models can be able to contribute to the formation of the necessary methodological coordinates of a modern systematic Orthodox theology. The answer to this reasonable question, in our opinion, could be the following. Both theologians, Florovsky and Zizioulas, alike, seem to express, in their particular theological way, faithful to some extent, one of the basic claims of the neo-patristic synthesis, which is the ability to synthesize the different voices, not in a homogeneous single voice, but in a colorful mosaic, where each work can illuminate or to show and formulate different aspects of the mystery of Christ. Both theologians insist on the uniqueness of personal diversity and individuality in communion, of course, to the extent, for example, the axiomatic exclusivity of the consensus patrum is questioned as a concept that assimilates and eliminates any differences between the fathers, according to Florovsky, or diversity as otherness, which is perceived as a sine qua non condition of patristic theology, which stems from the very existence of the triune God, according to Zizioulas. At the same time, the different methodology that each theologian follows, despite the coincidence in individual position that it leads to, should in no way be considered as an inhibiting factor, as if we're talking about medicine, to be honest, for the study of methodological coordination of Orthodox theology. Thus, any undoubtedly existing deficiencies or impasses in the theological program of one theologian, for example, the mystical deficit of Florovsky, his skepticism towards ontology, his historiocentric view of end of times, can be covered or illuminated by the way of the other theologian. For example, Eucharist starting point, constant ontological interest, eschatological view of history by Zizioulas. In this way, we manage to shape the appropriate, let's say, coincident synthesis by exceeding any extremities, any unilateralities or failures. Schematically speaking, the differentiation of the two theologians focusing on the historical or ontological commitment, the first by Florovsky, the second by Zizioulas, it seems to invite a modern Orthodox theology to a necessary serious study of the way on how theology should, on the one hand, maintain its ontological perspective, avoiding, therefore, moralism, and on the other hand, to be closely interconnected with history, to the extent that its focus should always be on the salvational feasibility of the apostolic preaching and not just a metaphysical preoccupation. In this perspective, the absence by both theologians of a comprehensive discussion of evil as one of the main issues of our fallen nature and historical experience will be able to help to the relevant problematic to regain its proper place in the theological discussion, to the extent that the moral, political effects of sin will be considered on man's path towards deification. In this context, both Florovsky and Zizioulas, due to the different methodological approach, can contribute, each one of them, to the formation of what can be considered as the two steps Orthodox systematic theology. In other words, a systematic theology which unfolds in two distinct, not necessarily contradictory steps. The one of the so-called church dogmatics, which clearly expresses the perspective of Florovsky, in other words, explanation of the apostolic sermon, and the so-called church and world dogmatics, which reveals the relevant methodology by Zizioulas. In other words, a correlation of the truth of the gospel with the existential problems of the modern world. What is required, in any case, is the faithfulness to the terms of the apostolic preaching, the agreement and sequence in theological way, which the eminent theologian, Jesus Christ, revealed with his presence and work. The asymmetric and unconfused submission of the founders and the parameters of theology to the eminent foundation of Christian theology, which is, of course, Jesus Christ. In other words, in order for someone to explain the apostolic sermon, he must listen to the anxiety of the surrounding worlds. What we are talking about, something that he wishes to arrive at, but at the same time, it will not live to today's century or create problems to the how something it is uttered. So Christian theology can use its eyes to understand the mystery of Christ. The problem arises when this gaze becomes reverse and change the relationship between church and Jesus Christ, or history. These two projects, via the different intensities, they do present the question of the theological question. For theology, where theology is considered as standing between lie and truth, between embodied word and world, as synchronously we have seen in history, and of course, the word of the two theologians. Thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Asproulis, for this very interesting contribution, continuity and discontinuity, the Metropolitan of Pergamon. We are grateful to him for the continuity he provided, inspired by Florovsky, and for the discontinuity. He took the concept of person and mask, and he created the theology of personhood. The return to fathers, neopatricity, etc. And he paid great attention to the concept of otherness, and he extended the Christology of Florovsky towards pneumatology. But there is also discontinuity. A philosopher used to say that you pay greater respect to your teacher if you stop at some point being their student. Now the floor to Father Nikolai Zakharov, Reverend Higher Monk at the Monastery of St. John the Baptist at Essex. His dissertation was supervised by Callistos Ware. He also translated and interpreted during the Holy Council on the island of Crete. And I know you were alone because your colleague had an accident and he couldn't help you. Thank you very much. The floor over to you.
Your All Holiness, Your Eminences, Holy Fathers, brothers and sisters, I am extremely honored to speak in front of you. It is a great honor, but also responsibility to convey the message of today's talk. I thought today to share with you what I find most important about this connection between Father Sophrony, Saint Sophrony, and His Eminence, Metropolitan John Zizioulas. In fact, I'm very grateful to the organizers of the conference, and the letter was signed by His Eminence Metropolitan Emmanuel. I don't know if they were aware that by this invitation they were making very important theological point. It was a masterstroke of theological professionalism. Because the topic itself implies that without Father Sophrony, mentioning Father Sophrony, there would be no complete picture of John Zizioulas' legacy. As well as for Father Sophrony, without mentioning John Zizioulas, his message, ascetical message, would not have such impact without theological defense and grounding offered by His Eminence. And today I thought to put them side by side theologically. Preparing for this presentation, I had a chance to go through various academic studies on His Eminence John Zizioulas. Researchers highlight different influences and try to present their picture how this great theologian John Zizioulas was born. They mention links with Russian Orthodox theologians which come from George Florovsky. They also mention influence of Fyodor Dostoevsky, Nikolai Berdyaev, Sergei Bulgakov, Vladimir Lossky. There are also suggestions that John Zizioulas was influenced by modern Greek Orthodox theologians like Nikos Nisiotis, and especially by Christos Yannaras. However, to my surprise, none of those studies mentioned Father Sophroni. And I thought today to share my knowledge and my experience and my observations to give a scope how much Father Sophroni might have influenced John Zizioulas. If we trace theological formation of Metropolitan, it unfolds for 50 years since his first doctoral thesis. It was written under guidance of George Florovsky. We all know the title of this thesis. The unity of the Church in the Eucharist and the Bishop during first 3 centuries. However, later in 1977, we observe a very interesting shift in theological interests of Metropolitan. He moves from historic ecclesiological issues to the metaphysics of person. He publishes his first article, 1977, From Mask to Person, the contribution of patristic theology to the concept of person. Who was behind this shift? The first name that comes to mind, George Florovsky. But in fact, George Florovsky was focused on Christology, and fathers didn't explicitly explore in depth the concept of person as it applies to humanity. They never speak about anthropological implications of the Trinity. Where is personhood, Eucharist, eschatology, the 3 main topics come from? I thought maybe contemporary theological climate, contemporary theologians, but once again, I couldn't single out a single influential figure who might have influenced John Zizioulas to such an extent. What I have observed, that in 1970s, His Eminence for the first time encountered Father Sophroni, his writings. By then, 1970s, Father Sophroni was complete as a theologian. All his ideas were mature. And he published his ideas in 1977 in his first book, His Life is Mine, in English. In early 80s, they met in person. His Eminence took train from Glasgow and came to Essex to see this mysterious Russian hieromonk who wrote this interesting book, His Life is Mine. And at that time, Father Sophroni was not yet known. He was a man hidden in a remote English village, living in poverty, almost invisible. And it is a great merit of the Metropolitan that at the first sight, he managed to discern in this simple hieromonk an event which later would have universal significance and importance. John Zizioulas displayed a genius sensitivity to the profound significance of Father Sophroni's message. No wonder that 50 years later, it was Metropolitan himself who actively assisted Father Sophroni's canonization as a saint in 2019. Their first meeting, Father Sophroni and John Zizioulas, took place in our monastery refectory. I'm sure many of you have visited our monastery and know that the fresco of the Holy Trinity is the biggest icon and fresco of the monastery. It is a replication of Andrei Rublev's icon of the Trinity. 3 figures, 3 angels sitting around the table. And Father Sophrony painted this icon because it was extremely important for him. And he wrote on top of the icon, "Let us create man in our own image and likeness." The Trinity, the icon of the Trinity, was the summary of the whole of Father Sophrony's vision. The Trinity is the model for mankind, and it should be applied to humanity in its ontological, Eucharistic, eschatological, and personal aspects. And of course, His Eminence Metropolitan John was immediately captivated by the depth and authenticity of Father Sophrony's message to present 3 figures, 3 persons, for whom being is communion. The Trinity for Father Sophrony gives answer to all our questions of modern times. Even such scholars as Andrew Louth mentions the icon of the Trinity when they discuss Metropolitan John Zizioulas' theology. But they never ask the question, where did John Zizioulas heard the explanation of this icon, and from whom? That is, from Father Sophrony. From that time on, Father Sophrony became his spiritual father, mapping the future of John Zizioulas' life, not only life in terms of spiritual counsel, but also his theological poria. His Eminence confirmed this affiliation and expressed his love to Father Sophrony in a very moving and personal tribute at the conference in Athens in 2008. John Zizioulas said that we had to ανεκτήμη το προνόημο να γνωρίσετε τον Πάτερ Σοφρόνια προσωπικά, να καθοδηγήσει πνευματικά από τις συμβουλές του, να σκύψει κάτω από το επετραχύλιο του και να λάβει τις πιο δύσκολες και μεγάλες αποφάσεις στη ζωή του με τη βοήθειά του. What is this great decision? It was Father Sophrony who insisted persistently that it is His Eminence's vocation to serve as a hierarch in the Church. He gave him a blessing to become a bishop. All these 3 topics were discussed by them: personhood, Eucharist, eschatology, and they both perceived that these topics had a key importance and they feel urgent theological need within the Orthodox Church, within the modern Orthodox theology, when it was craving for its release from, as His Eminence put it, from Babylonian captivity of Western influences. However, their first conversation, as Father Kirill recalls, was focused on the question of personhood. At the central theme of the whole Orthodox theology, allow me hypothetically reconstruct the theological encounter. Father Sophrony said to John Zizioulas, "The question of personhood, for me, is not a matter of philosophical quest. For me, it was a result of my personal, deep and existential crisis. In my youth, I came to question, in philosophical terms, my primitive faith in Christ. The Church asserts Christ is divine absolute. But how is it possible? How it is compatible with the fact that Christ was just a human individual? That's what we call the scandal of particularity, a stumbling block that haunted Christianity from early times. But for Father Sophrony, the scandal of particularity was the question of personhood. Can God of the universe be a human individual? And he started to abandon Christianity, not spiritually, but philosophically. When I was immature, he writes, the philosophy of the non-Christian East seemed so superior to our Christian commandment, love your neighbor. What is it, love your neighbor? Emotionalism? Psychology? At that time, the word person was equal to individual. If God is a person, then at its best, it is a compromise of his absoluteness. Absolute cannot be limited, restricted to individual or to a person. And then he shared with His Eminence his experience, which Father Sophrony had in Paris in 1925, when he was drawn back to Christianity by Christ himself. Father Sophrony describes, the day came suddenly when I recalled in the depths of my being the words of Christ, before Abraham, I am, and comprehended with all my being the personhood, personality of God, which is absolute in its extent. Person is infinite category, and person lies at the root of all that exists. Father Sophrony quotes John's Gospel in support of his claim. The Gospel says, all things came into being through him, the person. And without him, not even one thing came into being. In him, in person, was life, being. No doubt, this revelation which Father Sophrony shared with John Zizioulas at their first meeting at the monastery re-emerged, as we all know, in Metropolitan's article in 1991, Ontology of Personhood. For me, when I started reading it, it sounded like scholia on Father Sophrony's experience. I am that I am. But of course, the genius of His Eminence gave such a wonderful theological picture of this experience, explanation. It later emerged in his book, Being as Communion. His Eminence echoes Father Sophrony and writes in his book, Being as Communion, the personal existence of God constitutes his substance, makes it hypostasis. God exists on account of a person and not of substance. That's a quotation from His Eminence's book, Being as Communion. Metropolitan John had the insight of theological genius. At their first meeting, they immediately realized that Father Sophrony's ideas and Father Sophrony's presentation of personhood was so different from all what he has heard about before. For Father Sophrony, the question of personhood was not ideas. It was an ontological experience of the personhood of God. And as such, his approach bore unmistakable, incontestable stamp of authenticity. It was existential, empirical, truly patristic. Father Sophrony abandons the ideas and Aristotelian framework of thinking. He sets forth his argument on new grounds altogether, which appealed so much to His Eminence Metropolitan John. Father Sophrony writes, if you want to understand what the person is, you must follow different path. It doesn't come through logical construction. It comes through revelation. And once you receive this revelation of person, and you try to explain this principle to others through philosophical constructions, it becomes impossible. But when God gives direct revelation, there is no need for any other proof than life itself. Life that enters us, penetrates our whole being, illuminates all the abysses, and brings us out of confines of death. At that moment, His Eminence was absolutely delighted. What he sensed as a theologian, sensed as his theological intuitions, was confirmed and reflected in Father Sophrony's experience. His Eminence was vindicated. Because, as you know, there were many criticisms against John Zizioulas and objections in his theology of person as being philosophical, as he was accused of reading into the Fathers his own ideas. Writers emphasized the noticeable lack of his ascetic ethos. Well, after Father Sophrony, against the backdrop of Father Sophrony's ascetic experience, Zizioulas' theology becomes ascetic par excellence. For Father Sophrony, personalism was a central issue for us, for our modern world. The solution of all contemporary problems, he writes, religious, philosophical, political, sociological, and so on, depends upon this issue. What is the person? How you understand it? Misconceptions about what it means to be a person is the main root of the contemporary crisis of Christianity and of the universal apostasy nowadays. If people would perceive the core of this revelation, what it means to be a person, they would not have fallen away from Christ. In his book, Being as Communion, John Zizioulas discusses the topic of personhood. And he says that personhood is legacy of Christianity, unknown to both classic and Greco-Roman world. But this idea appears in Father Sophrony much earlier, in a different form. Father Sophrony writes to one of his spiritual children, what exactly is the most essential difference between Orthodoxy and other Christian confessions? Is it possible to answer this question in 2 words? Yes, for me. All the differences come down to how each confession understands the principle of the person. It determines the difference also between Christianity and all other religions. As a final point of my presentation, I wanted to highlight what impact their mutual symphony, harmony of these two theologians meant for the Orthodox theology. Father Sophrony and His Eminence John Zizioulas would definitely agree that Western personalism falls short of truth. It focuses on free will and sovereign reason, culminating in the famous formula, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. For Father Sophrony, it was the question not of cogito, but question of love. The important axis of personhood as we understand it is, in our Orthodox Church, that we are created in the image and likeness of God of love. I love, therefore I am. To my knowledge, Father Sophrony was the first one to use this formula in 1947 when he wrote his first book, St. Silouan the Athonite. And I think we are running out of time, but there is no need to provide further examples of their mutual solidarity in terms of theology. Time allowed us to pinpoint only one aspect, the question of personhood. And as a conclusion, I thought to suggest not to make a conclusion. Instead, I thought to offer an open-ended invitation to the future generation of scholars to explore further this connection between two giants, John Zizioulas and Saint Sophrony. We have no time now to discuss their mutual understanding of importance of Eucharist. The very first words which John Zizioulas said about Father Sophrony, he said, "I've never seen such a hermit, Christian ascetic, for whom Eucharist was so important." Father Sophrony speaks, John Zizioulas says, Eucharist constitutes the Church. Father Sophrony says, Eucharist constitutes monasticism. Father Sophrony speaks about liturgical asceticism. Father Sophrony speaks of monks as liturgical folk. When liturgy becomes the rule, the typicon of the monastery. We don't have time to speak about eschatology and Father Sophrony's perception of monastic life in eschatological terms. For Father Sophrony, what is not eschatological is not authentic. Or to put it in John Zizioulas terms, life which has its roots in the future and its branches in the present. One thing is clear. These two figures are inseparable. In these two major figures of our times, we have a symphony, convergence of the sanctity of asceticism and sanctity of top-class academic theology. Praxis and theoria, speaking in one voice. By highlighting the main contemporary themes of personhood, Eucharist and eschatology, as born of contemporary theological needs, they both lay foundation and map the direction for the future generation of Orthodox theologians and become thereby, in time, Holy Fathers of the Orthodox Church.
Thank you very much. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
We wish to thank Father Nikolaos for his speech, for this very interesting, actually, part that we didn't know that Father Sophronios actually had helped Professor Zizioulas to overcome his uncertainties about the proposal for the Patriarch to be ordained. That was a meeting that took place before 1986, right? So this is, I guess, something truly, truly interesting. Now, it is 7:30. According to schedule, we have a few minutes for discussion. The program says 30 minutes, but I don't know whether we have still, let's say, the fervor to continue a 30-minute discussion. I guess we are tired, but so let us give just a few minutes for discussion, maximum 10-15 minutes, please. First and foremost, are there any questions? This proximity is very, very interesting, I guess. I always believe that Giannaras, as far as the person is concerned, as far as Zizioulas is concerned, but now I guess that the transition. Please ask the speaker to speak closer to the microphone. Please ask the speaker to speak closer to the microphone. We cannot hear him.
Can you say it in English?
Yes. This interest of Zizioulas for personhood, is it an influence of Father Sophroni or of Giannaras and Nisiotis? I thought Giannaras and Nisiotis influenced Zizioulas. Yes, and you said Sophroni revealed to Zizioulas the deeper meaning of personhood.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I would be very happy to comment on this question. The problem is that their dialogue took place without any register. No one has registered what they talked about apart from the evidence which I have from Father Kirill. And we are talking about 1982 when they met for the first time. And undoubtedly, the first question was about theology of person, as I mentioned in my talk. As I mentioned for Father Sophroni, this perspective, his perspective on personhood, comes from a slightly different direction. For him, it was, as I mentioned in my talk, is not a question of philosophy. It was a question of his personal ascetic experience. He experienced what it means to be a person through asceticism. When we speak about the state of a monk in his prayer for the whole world as the ultimate realization of human person. Liturgical prayer as a realization of personhood for Father Sophroni. So Father Sophroni comes from this different perspective, and I think Father Sophroni's testimony was more, and influence was no less important, at least, than the influence of the scholars you mentioned.
Other questions, please? Άλλες, ποιος? Ο κύριος Παπα-Νικολάου.
Yeah, thank you. Father Zakharov, I'm Aristotle Papa-Nikolaou from the Orthodox Christian Study Center. So on the question of personhood, it's also fairly well known that Father Sophroni was influenced by Father Sergius Bulgakov, whom he knew. And of course we know that Bulgakov influenced Lasky, even though Lasky criticized him. And of course we know Lasky influenced Giannaras. So, yeah, so I guess I want to say, lurking in the background of 20th century Orthodox theology, perhaps is Father Sergius Bulgakov.
I'm very happy to answer this question as well. Thank you very much. Though Father Sophroni was taught by Sergei Bulgakov, but Father Sophroni was never stopped to be attentive and has his own point of view on what he has experienced, precisely his personal ascetic experience which determines his theology of the person. He has points where he disagrees with Bulgakov. Bulgakov presents personhood as a threesome subject, I, thou, we. Father Sophroni, what is this, he says? And where is the patrotita, the primacy of the Father in the Trinity, which absent in Bulgakov to great extent. Father Sophroni, he writes in his unpublished materials, once again I want to repeat, that his theology comes from his experience. He said, we learned about the Holy Trinity not from books, but through our monastic ascetic experience. And that's why he could easily reject what he felt alien in Bulgakov, and to remain in the main, how to say, to remain on the orthodox theological grounds very firmly. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. Άλλη ερώτηση. Ο Σεβασμιότατος Πισιδίας.
Father Nicholas, thank you very much. I am on the same, it's in the same line of Aristotle. What about Vladimir Lossky? Because Vladimir Lossky also wrote a lot about personhood, and Vladimir Lossky and Father Sophrony had been in contact. I've read also the correspondence, the very interesting, amazing correspondence between Father Sophrony and Father George Florovsky about Lossky. So could you tell us more about this?
I'm very happy to answer this question as well, but I hope the other participants will have a chance to speak as well. I don't want to monopolize the floor. But indeed, Father Sophrony admired Vladimir Lossky, and especially the concept of personhood. This distinction between individual and person, which comes also from Berdyaev and in general from the Russian religious thought, was taken Father Sophrony as the key to understand the meaning of the whole of the New Testament. If you look at the last judgment of Christ, the last judgment will take place on the category when individuals will be separated from those who become a person. So for him it was ultimate dimension of Christianity. What Lossky hasn't achieved in comparison to Father Sophrony, neither Bulgakov, neither Florovsky. For Father Sophrony, it was important to apply all our theology, both Christology and theology of the Trinity, to our daily ascetic life. Trinity, the life of the Trinity, is the typicon of our monastery. Everything what we know about the Trinity, relationship between the persons of the Trinity, has direct relevance to our interhuman, interpersonal relationship. So on this respect, Father Sophrony was, I don't say revolutionary, but he was the first to see the importance of Trinitarian dogma, unlike Lossky and Bulgakov, in its ascetical implications, to apply the life of the Trinity directly onto the life of monastic community. That's what I can say.
Mr.
Thank you
Kalaitsidis.
very much for really excellent papers. Thank you, Father Nicholas, for mentioning Berdyaev, because I was about to ask you, what about Berdyaev? Because we cannot conceive the discussion about the theology of personhood without Berdyaev, but you mentioned it, so thank you for this. Θα κάνω μια ερώτηση στον κύριο Ασπρούλη.
I have a question for Mr. Asproulis, for Dr. Asproulis. Per the work of the Metropolitan of Pergamon, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. So my question is the following: how can we interpret this great familiarization of the works of Pergamon in the Anglo-Saxon, where we have the translation of Hans Ecclesiasticus, where we have no less than 1,000 copies being sold, whereas in English we saw that it had a much greater impact, and it's still being discussed till today. But still, from the same Anglo-Saxon world, we saw the first critique against Wigan's communion. We remember the article of Alan Brown in the volume published by Douglas Knight for Zizioulas. We remember the article by Alan Brown as far as the Anglo-Saxon critique. So how can we, on the one hand, talk about the great impact, at the same time the great critique by Anglo-Saxons? In Germany, in my times, Florovsky and Zizioulas, and afterwards, had not such an impact. We had a discussion with Jobanidis earlier today. In 2006, I taught in Bern, in Switzerland, and 10 MA students didn't know the name of Zizioulas. And a PhD that was submitted in Greece, drafted in Germany, for Grigorios Nissis, there was no single reference about Christianism and Zizioulas. So how can also these be interpreted, whereas in the so-called German theology, with the different... Please ask the speaker to be closer to the microphone. We cannot hear the speaker. We cannot interpret the speaker. So thank you, Padelis, and yourself, of course, for the intervention. If we were to see the historical course of Zizioulas, starting from Greece, here we would remain unobserved until recently. He goes to Italy. The impact of his work is not the one should expect. He went to the United States, he then returned rapidly back. In the UK, we can say that his thought was deepened in issues of theology. He came into a discussion with the contemporary affairs back there, and due to his studies there and the fact that he's taught in the UK, I guess it was the framework within he managed to engage a dialogue with the Western world. That is why his teachings were so impactful, let's say, in the UK, and that is why he received a lot of critique, because it is in the UK, it was in the Anglo-Saxon world that his work, let's say, matured. That is why this has this relationship between impact and, of course, critique. And let's be honest, also, English is the lingua franca, was and still is. If German language had a similar impact, maybe we could see some impact in Germany. Now, any other question for Father Demetrios? No question? I have a question for you, for Father Nikolaos, as far as the relationship between Agios Sophronios and the late Metropolitan of Pergamos. How can we explain the fact that never?
How do you explain that never Metropolitan John Zizioulas refers to Saint Sophrony?
I think if you read his book, Remembering the Future, the references are multiple, and as well as his latest book, 101 Sermons, when 1/3 of the book is dedicated to Saint Sophrony, I think that will clear the picture. That's what I would say.
Yes, no. He also used to talk to me about the Saint Sophronius, and I think he used to visit the monastery for certain weeks or a month, and he thought it was very important for his theology and for his spiritualism. So if there's no further question, so let's wrap up with Padelis, please.
Thank you, Father, but I would like to come back a little bit about this, because I think this is a quite important point you made. We cannot negate, we cannot avoid the fact that Metropolitan John Zizioulas, in many of his writings, he was very critical towards monasticism. For example, speaking about therapeutic and Eucharistic ecclesiology, he made a real point there, and it was quite well known that he was very critical. I think, for example, he never went to Mount Athos, if I'm not mistaken, and he was not enthusiastic about this idea. So, okay, I don't go to contest your testimony, but please don't make a kind of how to say. A kind of idealized picture, because they are really different trends, and Metropolitan John Zizioulas was par excellence the one who was very reserved toward monasticism. Thank you.
Εγώ να πω κάτι κι εγώ σαν ερώτηση. Ο Zizioulas λέει
Zizioulas says that in the kingdom of God only Eucharist shall exist. No missionaries, no asceticism. That's what he said. And if you do remember, Padelis, in my speech when I talk asceticism and freedom, I said, how can we imagine and think about God in society and not to be also ascetic? So, is there an ascetic Eucharist? So I agree with Mr. Kalaitsidis that what His Holiness said today, and it's very important about Eucharism and asceticism, that is eschaton in different definitions, is something that, let's say, has nothing to do with what Zizioulas used to say about monasteries and monastic life and the non-ecclesiastical features or characteristics of some monks, at least.
As you have mentioned, His Eminence wasn't a frequent visitor to Mount Athos, but he was a regular visitor of our monastery in Essex, where he found himself completely at home precisely on this point. If you look at the theological tradition in general, does it speak much about Eucharistic theology? Of course it does. We have Isaac the Syrian, homily 46, and Mark the ascetic mentions, I think, liturgical dimension of monastic life. But for Father Sophrony, monasticism found its expression in the liturgy. I don't know if many of you know, for Father Sophrony, he didn't want to lay foundation to the monastery. He wanted to lay foundation to the liturgical prayer. When he came to England, we are looking for a place to build the liturgy. Monasticism is the fruit of the liturgy. His idea was to extend the liturgical state, which we have for 2 hours celebrating in the state of Eucharist, to extend it to the whole day. That monks should live liturgy not only 2 hours in the morning, but to dedicate the whole life to the liturgy. That we are talking about liturgical asceticism. And liturgy, if you notice, is not just celebration. It invites us to asceticism of love. Let us love one another, that with one mind we may confess. And this liturgical asceticism of brotherly love turned into a very strict discipline in our monastery. We were not allowed to have anything against our brother, neither word nor even thought, Father Sophrony. So this was liturgical asceticism for us, to build up liturgy, mutual love. And that's why His Eminence John Zizioulas immediately felt that this monasticism, as Father Sophrony, liturgical monasticism, was different probably from many other monasteries. I don't want to idealize, but he mentions in his first meeting, he mentioned afterwards to Father Kirill, I have never seen such a monk for whom liturgy was everything. And that's why he anchored his life there, I suppose, because of this liturgical dimension. What is not liturgical for Father Sophrony, what doesn't come from the liturgy, is not authentic. There is no non-liturgical asceticism. And in this respect, he is different from perhaps many monks. Anyway, I don't think we have time.
Thank you very much. Call not be translated. Asceticism is again against evil, and evil will fail when the kingdom of God will arrive. That is why the late Metropolitan said that asceticism is not our objective per se. I should arrive at the liturgy, I should participate in the liturgy, and that is why he referred to the Holy Maria from Egypt that arrived finally at the liturgy to receive the communion. That is what our late Metropolitan used to remind us. Thank you very much. Asceticism is the whole Christianity, let's be honest. And asceticism is a shrunk version of what it is, fight against evil or not. But this is something to be discussed by the next generations, I guess. So thank you very much. Thank Your Holiness, Your Eminences, and of course the three rapporteurs, that each one of them. Dr. Nicholas Prus was one of the assistants of the late Metropolitan, the Metropolitan John of Pergamon. Father Nicholas used to visit him at his monastery, and of course Father Demetrios, as a doctor, of course, he met Metropolitan of John of Pergamon in a rather difficult situation where he managed to, let's say, show something rather different of his personality, of the way of thinking and understanding. So if we resolve the problem of death, so we can find any given solution. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you, all of you. Tomorrow morning we shall continue our proceedings at 9 a.m. I wish to thank also our interpreters who do this very difficult task of interpreting our discussions. Good luck to all of you. See you all tomorrow morning. Goodbye.